Two kings, two revolutions, two history podcasters who can't wait to talk about these monumental events. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special Q&A episode between the history of England and the French Revolution and Napoleon podcast. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Will Clark, and I'm the host of the French Revolution and Napoleon by Grey History. And joining me today is the amazing David Crowther of the History of England podcast.
I'm rarely called amazing. In this household, at least, anyway, Will. So thank you for that. And I shall mention it to my wife. Anyway, hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here on the Q&A. It's going to be fun.
It's going to be absolutely brilliant. And for those of you that don't know, David has just finished covering the English Revolution. And so we thought, what better time than to sit down and compare these world-changing events? A few months ago, we asked for listener questions as we prepared for this episode, and as always, you delivered. And so over the next hour or so, we are going to be tackling it all. We're going to be talking about the monarchs, the successes, the failures, the key turning points, and of course, the similarities and differences between these divisive revolutions. Along the way, I'm sure we'll touch on a few controversial opinions, but hopefully everyone still has their heads by the end of it. Now, I think it makes sense to begin with the two men at the center of the action, the monarchs themselves. And David, we had all sorts of questions about Charles I and Louis XVI. So I suppose to start us off, when you think of Charles I, what are his defining characteristics? What makes Charles Charles? And, to quote a contemporary, is this really a tyrant worse than Nero, or do you view him as something else?
Will you all ask me to jump to the end, I suppose? Yes, says he was a tyrant. We can talk a little bit about how good a tyrant he is when we come to one of the first questions. But more important, I think, is his personal characteristics, what kind of a man he was. And in many ways, he's a very attractive sort of bloke. He's especially following James, who again is a very interesting man, his father, but had a rather louche reputation, it has to be said, if that's the right word, and spent a lot of money and had a rather wild court. His son, Charles, his second son, Charles, was much more austere, much more controlled, was very keen for his court to be a model to the rest of the country, as royal courts were meant to be, as Elizabeth had made sure her court was, actually. The trouble with Charles is he's the perfect second son. I think one of the people who asked a question made the same point. He was never meant to be king. His brother Henry was meant to be king, but his brother was badly behaved enough to go and die, which is thoughtless of him, to be honest. Charles was cultured. He'd made it brilliant. He's a great patron of the arts. He would have been a fantastic second son. I mustn't mention William and Harry here, must I? It's far too contemporary. So we're going to cut that comment that I might possibly have made. So he's got many great qualities. He's a good family man. He doesn't play away. He behaves very well. But he's also arrogant, aloof. He's very personally insecure. If any kind of opposition, he takes as rebellious. He's not good at dealing with people who don't come round to his point of view. He's very inflexible. Throughout these events, he was completely unable to see value in people who opposed him or who ended up maintaining different views from him. And he had slightly odd views. He had a very high opinion of kingship given to him by his father, and crucially, a very high opinion of the actual divinity of bishops. This will lead to trouble. One more word. He was, in essence, the perfect martyr. He was brave, courageous, strong set of principles, inflexible. He died very well.
There you go. I think that's a pretty celebratory commentary of Charles I. I think I share similar views about Louis XVI in the sense that I am not as critical of him as perhaps some others are. When I look at Louis XVI, I kind of view him from the perspective of two lenses, the man in private and the man in public. And privately, Louis XVI is warm, he's kind, he's gentle, he's clearly a devoted family man. He's a little introverted. He has a range of quite nerdy hobbies, but as someone who runs a history podcast, I'm not about to throw stones. Yes. I view him...
Can't criticize him for that, can you? Yeah.
No, absolutely not. And the way that I think of Louis XVI is that, like, if you were being dragged to a family barbecue that you didn't really want to go to, your first question would be, well, is Uncle Louis going to be there? At least he's someone that I can have a chat to and relate with. And, you would find him a perfectly agreeable personality. Unfortunately, Louis XVI is no ordinary uncle, and he's no ordinary person. He is the king of one of the great powers of the 18th century. And in this position, Louis XVI is so out of his depth. He does not have the characteristics required of a monarch, especially of a monarch of a nation like France. He's fickle, he's indecisive, he's unable to make and then unable to hold to those decisions. There is a historian, Edward Lyle, who has a great line. He says that Louis XVI is totally incapable of standing by himself. He leant successively or simultaneously on his aunt, his wife, his ministers, his courtiers, as ready to change his policy as his advisor. And I suppose, in summary, Louis XVI is an absolute monarch without an absolute bone in his body. He is not the person that you want to be running the French state in a crisis, but he would have made a perfectly good small prince or elector in the Holy Roman Empire. And dare I say it, given that at this point in time, you English have Mad King George III, I actually think Louis XVI would have made a great English constitutional monarch at a time when the monarchs were wielding very little real political power.
Poor old George.
Well, poor old Louis as well.
Indeed, poor old Louis.
So, David, one of the questions that we got from listeners was, what if both monarchs had been more ruthless? And for me, when I heard this question for Louis XVI, ruthlessness is not his biggest problem. To me, it's the fact that he's indecisive, he lacks political skill, he has an inability to read the room. A perfect example of this is early on in the Revolution. Much like Charles I, he needs to raise taxes, and there's kind of the equivalent of ship money, if you like, where Louis XVI is coming up, or his ministers are coming up with some creative ways to try to raise revenues. And they're kind of forcing taxation reforms through the traditional courts. And needless to say, they're resisting. And on one occasion, Louis XVI actually falls asleep publicly while this is happening. And on another occasion, his cousin, the Duc d'Orléans, challenges this and says, is this legal? And he says, Louis XVI says, it's legal because I wish it. But then, just to make matters worse, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, oh, I don't know, you're the master, of course. And so what you have with Louis XVI is a king that, as I said, has no political skill, has no ability to read the room. He's neither respected nor feared. And so, for me, ruthlessness only matters if the king knows what he wants to do and has the means to implement it. And I don't think Louis XVI has that. But I'm curious, Charles I does have a much firmer idea of what he wants and his agenda, and is much more decisive and willing to back ministers. So in the case of Charles, would ruthlessness have made a much bigger difference to his predicament?
I think it would. We are talking about the English Revolution, and I've been a little, a little bit naughty in calling it the English Revolution and a bit stubborn. The Scots call it the Scottish Revolution. I don't see any reason why I shouldn't call it the English Revolution. But it is, of course, the Revolution of Three Kingdoms, and you can't understand the whole thing without understanding the situation in Scotland and in Ireland, because they're all interconnected. So I might argue that, yes, Charles could have been much more ruthless, and I think he could have crushed dissent. A lot of people were on his side. A lot of people believed, actually, that a king could be absolute at the time, believed him when he said that the king's word is law. So he did have a constituency. People had a lot of respect for him because of, what I've said earlier about his personal characteristics. So there are critical occasions. The arrest of the 5 members, for example, if he'd done that much earlier, if he'd really cracked down. Of course, he doesn't have a tool to use. He doesn't have a standing army, as they do in France in the 18th century. So it is much more difficult for him to be ruthless. But I would have said that it is possible that in England, at least, he could have been much more ruthless and closed things down. I doubt he could have done that in Scotland. In Scotland, it was all about religion. And in Scotland, there was such a groundswell behind the National Covenant that I don't think there was anything he could have done except conciliate and not do what he did and try and introduce Laudianism into Scotland. Ireland, again, I don't think ruthlessness would have helped him there, because once it blows off in 1641, it is chaos in Ireland. But what he could have done there has been much more conciliatory. It's a difficult question to answer. My gut feeling is that in England, at least, yes, if he'd been really ruthless, he had enough innate support for him to have scotched this, nipped it in the bud. His problem actually is one more thing on that. His problem is that he's got too much respect for the ancient constitution, ironically. He wants people to see that he's doing things in a legal way, even if he's not being actually legal. So he tries to use forms and ways which are just not decisive and good if you're going to be a Chairman Mao or a ruthless tyrant.
We had another question from a listener that asked, at what point does each monarch lose the ability to use force to create compliance? And it sounds like there, for you, the situation in Ireland and Scotland, perhaps there wasn't a moment for that option to exist. But in England, is there a specific moment that you kind of look at and say that was the opportunity, or perhaps alternatively, a specific moment and you look at that and goes, that's too far, like you've missed your opportunity, as you just said, in the case of the 5 members?
The death of the Earl of Bedford, I think, is the key point. In May 1642, I think I got that right. It has to be said, if he'd reconciled England and if he'd used Bedford's good offices to do that, he'd made key concessions well before Strafford gets executed, then I think he could have raised an English army and maybe he could then have imposed a settlement on Scotland. Cromwell, after all, does the same. And indeed in Ireland. Bedford was a bridge that showed a way to conciliate. And if he'd thrown Strafford to the wolves, as a more ruthless king would have done earlier, if he'd given the concessions that Bedford wanted him to give, he could have done it. But in May 1641, Strafford is executed, Bedford dies, and that is the end of any chance, I think, for reconciliation without force. How's about the French Revolution? What's the situation there?
I think, for me, the problem is that Louis XVI, while there is a royal army, it is completely unreliable. And later on, we're going to get into some of the similarities and differences, but France is experiencing all sorts of crises, most noticeably a bankruptcy crisis, which does impact your ability to pay soldiers and kind of, foster loyalty and discipline, as well as other crises as well. And I'm not really sure that Louis XVI, even if you put aside the issue of his personality, was ever in a position where military force was the best option or, to the extent that it was a viable option. I think that there's just too many issues that France is dealing with, and there's such a great need to modernize the regime in some form that military force, it gets very complicated very quickly. And part of the reason why Louis XVI doesn't really try to use military force and then backs off when he does attempt to is that it looks like it will result in a civil war rather than a simple, crushing of dissent.
Yeah. Very good. So basically, our kings were very poor tyrants. They've gone down in history as tyrants. But if they'd been, certainly if Charles had been more brutal, be a better tyrant, Charles, is the message there. I mean, it's a good job he wasn't, obviously, but,
I think compared to the individuals that we associate with tyranny in, say, the 20th century, Louis XVI and Charles, they just don't hold a candle to them.
It's quite an interesting question, actually, because quite a few people call Cromwell a dictator and more of a tyrant than Charles. The word tyrant and dictator are quite often used interchangeably. And I think there's an important distinction to be made. I don't think either Cromwell or Charles were dictators. They simply don't have the tools at their disposal to do that. They don't have the officers of state. They don't have the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy in the 17th century is tiny. It's a few blokes. They don't have the levers. Government depends on local JPs who are unpaid in order to make it work in the 17th century. So neither Cromwell or Charles had any capability to be a dictator, even with an army for Cromwell. But tyrant is about transgressing the rules of the state. And Charles certainly transgresses the rules of the state. Cromwell's in a slightly different situation because they're making up the rules of the state. But yeah, I think there's an important distinction to be made between a tyrant and a dictator.
I think that's fair enough. I mean, I suppose what's interesting, though, is that even though we will make the distinction with the benefit of hindsight, both these men are obviously accused by revolutionaries of being tyrants and are placed on trial for that crime. And we had a great question from one listener about the trial strategies of these two kings, and essentially what would have occurred if perhaps Charles had used Louis's strategy and vice versa. And Louis's strategy is a little more complicated than Charles, so I might kick off. Louis XVI, he actively engages with his trial. So his trial is conducted by the National Convention, which has been elected by universal male suffrage shortly after the fall of the monarchy to essentially figure out what the constitutional arrangements will be, and it will be the body that brings France its first republican constitution. And so this is not like the rump parliament or anything like that. Universal male suffrage has elected this body only months before. And so Louis doesn't really question the body's right to try him. Instead, he actively engages with the process. He denies his guilt on each kind of article of indictment. He will offer reasoning about how it was the work of his ministers, or that a particular crime was, or a particular accusation was legal, or that a constitution didn't exist for particular things he was being accused of. And actually, this engagement with the process results in Louis XVI getting a lot of sympathy, not only with the public, but actually with the deputies themselves, who are kind of acting as the prosecution, the judges, the jurors, and ultimately the executioners. And so because Louis engages with this process, the deputies actually vote to give him a legal counsel and give him legal representation. And I think it speaks to how capable that Louis did by himself, that when he gets a legal defense, they essentially just reiterate, maybe slightly more polished, but they essentially just reiterate Louis XVI's talking points. And so obviously it doesn't work for Louis, he still ends up executed. But I think if he were to adopt Charles I's obstructionism, if you like, and refusal to engage in the process, then I don't think it would have earned him any goodwill from the deputies. And if anything, I just think it would have made him worse. It would have made things worse for him. So if, to the nuts of the question is, how would Louis XVI have gone if that strategy had been reversed? I don't think it would have done him any favors to adopt the strategy of Charles. And I suspect, because he has obviously been reading about the English Civil Wars, I suspect that Charles's fate is informing his decision in part.
That's really interesting. I'd read that Louis read a biography of Cromwell or a biography of Charles in prison as he was waiting trial. That must have been uplifting for the lad. I think it's fascinating to see what might have been are always a bit difficult, aren't they? Because I don't think there was any chance Charles was ever going to engage with the process. That would have meant denying his very existence for the last few years, to admit that the rebels had a point, to admit that they were honest men, to admit that he could have contributed towards death and chaos, was completely out with his mental facilities. I don't think there's any shadow of doubt that he ever felt he was wrong. So I think it was impossible anyway. But in terms of, and also to do him justice, he had an eye to the long view. He wanted the monarchy to survive, and he did not want to hobble his descendants with any idea that he could accept the legitimacy. And he would never have accepted the legitimacy of a complete vote of all the people, even without the rumpification of Parliament. They had no right to do what they were doing. You could not try a king. And I think Louis makes the same argument, doesn't he, that in terms of all those crimes that he was accused of earlier when he was king, well, you can't accuse me of those, he says, because I was a king. The king is above the law. So if he had argued, I think it could well have been, I don't think he was ever not going to be killed. The army had the bit between the teeth to him. There is a man of blood who betrayed their trust time after time, and he simply could not be trusted. He would simply not live to any commitments he made because he'd proved it over and over again. So I don't think he'd have got off. But it would have been quite interesting because he would have got a lot of support. There was a lot of support anyway. Famously, Anne Fairfax shouts from the crowd, not 1/4 of the people of England. And of course, he could have argued all the points. I'm pretty sure he would have died. It might well have made the royalist cause stronger. But I don't think it would have made a material difference to the trial. He was still, his head was on borrowed time.
No, fair enough. It's interesting. Louis XVI's trial is a little different because there is essentially a violent revolution in Paris which overthrows the monarchy. The revolutionaries that get elected to the National Convention that quite quickly declare a republic and then draft the Republican Constitution, they're in this odd spot where either the king is guilty of treason or they are. And so you end up in this dynamic where Louis XVI is going to be found guilty. As to whether he is going to be executed, there are a variety of factors at play. It's a very close vote. I think you can make the argument that his death is not guaranteed, and there are factors that maybe aren't immediately obvious that I think play into it. For example, at the time of Louis's execution, the now Republican army is scoring unbelievable military success. It will not last long. But that military success, which essentially starts from the moment that the Republic is declared, it does two things. First of all, it reinforces the perception that the court was betraying the nation because the French were losing the war until Louis was removed from power. But it also removes this idea and this argument from some that Louis XVI needs to be kept alive as a bargaining chip, because all of a sudden the French armies are pouring into Belgium, they're pouring into Piedmont, Sardinia, they're scoring tremendous success. Well, these deputies are talking about establishing sister republics in Naples and in Poland. And so why do you need to keep the king alive as a bargaining chip? So there's other factors at play here beyond what maybe immediately come apparent in terms of just like the raw, did he do this and should he be executed?
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, in the end, although I'm a great admirer of the trial of Charles and how hard the English tried to make it legal and tried to make it formal and give it gravitas, in the end, it's as much about politics as it is about law. And Charles could not be trusted, politically speaking, and therefore, whatever the law said, he had to die. So when Louis dies, do you think the death of Charles gives the French revolutionaries the license to do what they do, to kill the aristocracy and ultimately the royal family because of what had happened in England?
I saw this question come in and it was a fascinating question. It makes sense, right? It makes sense that, well, the English killed Charles and therefore the French felt obliged that they had to kill Louis. But I actually think the answer is no. I don't think Charles's execution kind of gives the French a license to kill Louis XVI. And in a weird way, and this is a little counterintuitive, but in a weird way, if anything, I think that had Charles been spared, had he been exiled or banished or some other punishment, I think the French would have been more inclined to execute Louis XVI. And to understand why, we need to look at the vote to condemn Louis XVI. There's a common myth that he is executed by just a single vote. And that's not entirely accurate. There is a simple majority in favour of unconditional execution by one vote. And then there's a large vote in favour of exile or banishment, but there are also votes that are kind of conditional votes on execution. We don't execute him until after the war, or we have a separate debate about clemency or whatever. And so when you actually look at the kind of vote split between execution or not execution, you would need to flip maybe 5% of the deputies, or about 30 votes, to spare Louis. And so the question here really is, does Charles's execution, materially impact that proportion of votes? And because the National Convention is conducting this trial, we have records of all their debates and their speeches. And you can go looking for references to Charles I. And you do see the occasional reference of, well, the English killed Charles and therefore we must kill Louis. But you don't see that as much as you might think. What you see far more of is the English killed Charles, their republic failed. So what are we going to do differently to ensure that we do not end up with a Cromwell-style military dictatorship or a restoration of the monarchy? And the French revolutionaries are steeped in history. They are also aware that the murder of Caesar results not in the restoration of the Roman Republic, but with the Roman Empire. So they are drawing on these historical examples. And so where Charles's trial comes into the trial of Louis XVI is more about what mistakes did they make that we won't make ourselves, and how are we sure that we're not going to make those mistakes? And to finish on this point, because I said at the start, I actually think that if Charles had been banished or exiled, it might have encouraged Louis's execution. Let's take an example where Charles is banished or exiled or something, and you still end up with a military dictatorship, or you still end up with a restored monarchy. I think the lessons that the French would have taken out of that is to kill a monarchy, you must kill the king. That if you want to secure your republic, you need to treat the deposed monarch like any other guilty citizen. And so I think that would have incentivized the French to have executed Louis XVI if Charles had had a lesser punishment, but you still ended up with a restored monarchy or some similar sort of situation by a military dictatorship, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. You keep calling Cromwell a military dictatorship, incidentally. Do they use that word?
They do. They very much consider they consider Cromwell to be a tyrant and a despot and a dictator, yes. So they are very much, and you will use that word in the debates of the trial. Cromwell is referenced as I said, there are examples from Roman history and the like that they will reference as well.
It's quite interesting that it comes up so much. And certainly the same thing happens in England with the return of the monarchy. The message has spread that Cromwell was, of course, a dictator, that nobody liked him, that he was a tyrant, he had no support and blah, 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 and he was a terrible man. That's very much promulgated after the Restoration. And it takes until the 19th century for people to realise that truth was a little different.
Yes, Cromwell's reputation at the end of the 1700s is not quite the same as it is today. I think, it's that old story that history is written by the victors, and the victors was a restored monarchy, and Cromwell suffered for it.
It did indeed, which I think comes up in a couple of questions further down, actually. We should maybe move on to something rather more important than these trivial questions, because, obviously that's what they are, and go to the question, did Marie Antoinette really say, let them eat cake? And is there any truth in the rumour that in actual fact it was really lardy cake she was referring to, which is, of course, a deeply nutritious food?
Yes.
And I can recommend to anybody.
So there's no evidence that Marie Antoinette was saying this at all. The phrase is kind of attributed to her well into the 19th century. So she has been dead for quite some time. The line itself is kind of assigned to an unnamed French princess, but at the time that this publication occurs, Marie Antoinette is not even in France. She is not a French princess. She's a child. So no, Marie Antoinette did not say in any way, shape or form, let them eat cake.
Maybe to try and make a serious point out of all this, that the listener asked about, were anything as tone deaf about the working classes. And of course, we're not on the working classes, etc. But, I take the point. And there was a lot of conversation in the revolutionary period in England in particular, but also to a degree in Scotland, but in de facto, about a world turned upside down and the outrage of the aristocracy that the county committees were being run by ordinary people, merchants and farmers and that sort of thing. Absolute outrage that these people should be so uppity. You can't construct a Marxist edifice around this as Christopher Hill tried to do, but nonetheless it is still very much there. And in Scotland, very much the middling classes who are now pushing the aristocracy around, which is very unusual for Scotland up to that point, and the aristocracy will take their revenge on that. But another factor is that there's not the same economic imperative around the English revolutions and indeed the British War of Three Kingdoms. They weren't destitute, they weren't starving. The last famine in Britain is a regional one in Cumbria in 1623. So in England, at least, there's no famine. There is, of course, horribly in Ireland and indeed in Scotland, actually, in the 18th century. But there isn't that economic imperative in the way that there is in France.
No, absolutely. And I know that towards the end, we're going to get into where these revolutions have a lot of parallels and where they significantly diverge. And as it relates to the kind of economic crises that France is facing, including crises in hunger and hyperinflation and the like, that is where you do get quite a reasonable difference. But I wonder if now's the time maybe to start with one of the big differences, I suppose, of our revolutions, and that's the matter of religion. And religion isn't that big for the French Revolution, at least initially, but I know that religion is incredibly important when we're discussing the War of the Three Kingdoms and the broader, English Revolution. So I suppose, David, are you able maybe to outline for the benefit of my listeners who would be unfamiliar with religion being such a key cause from the outset, what the kind of situation was as it related to religion as we lead up to the English Revolution?
I can think of nothing I would rather do, Will. Of course, it is going to take me about a couple of hours. So you might want to go off and make yourself a cup of tea, have some lardy cake, whatever, and I advise your listeners to do the same. I will try and keep it as brief as I can, I promise. I know. So I think there are two key background things to remember about religion at the time of James I and the beginning of the reign of Charles I, 1620s. First of all, in 1600, religious diversity and sectarianism was not an issue anymore. Elizabeth and Whitgift had effectively stopped the separatist Puritan element. Catholicism was down to about 3% of the population. For all intents and purposes, the Anglican Church had won, and it was a religious uniformity, which is the dream of every medieval kingdom and was the aim of everybody in Europe too. Because religious diversity meant essentially going against conscience and the word of God. So what Charles does critically is his introduction of Laudianism in the 1620s and 30s destroys that unity. It hacks off Anglicans, but what it does is release separatism and Puritan sectarianism. So one of the key things is we have a lot of religious diversity by the time 1641 comes around. Presbyterianism in Scotland, Presbyterianism in England and a growing group of independents, and of course Catholicism and Protestant settlers from Scotland and England in Ireland. So there's a lot of religious diversity going around, and it's critical. Second point is talk about the fear of papacy. So it's not just about Catholicism, and in fact, Cromwell in particular has no real beef with Catholicism. I'm sure you'll be outraged to hear in the sense that he befriends a lot of Catholics. He believes personally that everybody should be able to practice their religion as they choose. But the exception for him or everybody in England, essentially, and in Scotland, is that the Pope is the actual Antichrist. It's not just an insult, a casual insult on the Pope. The Pope is actually the Antichrist. And he is all kidding everybody who believes poor Catholics are being fooled by the Pope who's dragging you to hell. I mean, I find that it is incredible, in today and age to think that, but that is what they believe. This was a plot. And therefore, priests and the Pope were culpable in fooling the people, Catholics and Protestants alike. The other thing about Catholicism, and this is the last point I make, is not just about religion. As far as they see, the English constitution is perfection. And everywhere in Europe, they see Catholic despots. So the advance of Catholicism is also about the end of English liberties. That is all I have to say about the context until we get on to the question.
So I suppose the question then is how important, dare I say I might know the answer to this or what you're about to say, but how important is religion to the English Revolution and the broader War of the Three Kingdoms?
Quite important. Next question. But obviously, critical. I mean, it's obviously very important because it drives the Scottish Revolution, which drives everything. It becomes the engine. So it is critical. It is at least 50%. I don't know how you'd put a figure on it, but it's at least as important as the secular questions. But also those questions are intertwined because, as I say, Catholicism is about the imposition of despotism in their view. It is about the erosion of liberties. Bishops, which Charles gives such weight to, they are part of that despotism because they have a court called the High Commission and they're telling people exactly what they can and can't do. So the two are intertwined. It's incredibly essential. You cannot understand it without religion. In a sense, it is a struggle between religious uniformity and religious toleration. And under Cromwell, you have a greater degree of toleration than Britain had ever had before.
It is fascinating how the issue of religion just kind of pierces so many other topics as well, because as you say, it's not only should bishops exist, but does the king have a right to appoint them? And then how does that impact his right to do other things, such as raise taxes or appoint royal officials that have nothing to do with religion at all? Like it just kind of finds a way to seep into debates that you would think would be largely secular or civil in nature, all of a sudden this religious backdrop is kind of hovering over debates that aren't necessarily, they don't come to mind as being really linked to religion, but it turns out it is.
Yeah, very true. Also, so I think, it'd be interesting. The question, I suppose, that we need to move to is what is the contrast between the role religion played? But I would say one of the differences, it seemed to me, is that debate about uniformity has been solved by the time the French Revolution comes around. Louis XIV has persecuted, killed, forcibly converted or exiled all Protestants. So the amount of religious diversity is tiny. It's no longer an issue. Is that right, or am I jumping to conclusions?
That's more or less correct. So at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, at least 95% of the population is Catholic, probably more. There is a small proportion of Protestants that remain in France, and Louis XVI actually is starting to give them some measure of rights just before the revolution. But as you say, and I suppose this is one of the key differences between our two revolutions, is that religion is not an issue. It's not a discussion point as the French Revolution arrives. The French Revolution, in a nutshell, it is a bankruptcy crisis, and the state cannot meet its expenditure and it needs to raise taxes, and this then opens Pandora's box. And there are a whole bunch of other factors at play, but in a nutshell, why we get the French Revolution when we do is because of a bankruptcy crisis. And religion is just not a discussion point. Where it is a discussion point is things around, well, what rights should the church have in relation to taxation or taxation exemption? What privileges should the church have? But that is part of a broader conversation around the privileges and rights of the nobility and a lack of equality between what we call the third estate, everyday common people, and the privileged orders and the clergy and the nobility. So religion is just not really a discussion point. However, in saying that, while the lack of religion as a cause is a big difference between our two revolutions, a key similarity is that in time, religion will become a key source of both destabilization and radicalization. And essentially what happens, if I really, slim this down into a 30-second headline, is that to solve their bankruptcy crisis, the revolutionaries nationalized church property. And in nationalizing church property to help pay for the expenses of the state, that means that priests, everyday Catholic priests, essentially become public employees. And the moment that they are employees of the state, then the deputies start to go, well, actually, we can reform the church. We can make bishops and priests elected officials. We can curtail bishoprics and administration zones. We can ignore the Pope. We can do a whole bunch of reforms that essentially about half of all priests reject. And this drives a real wedge between the Catholic Church and the French Revolution. And what that means is that those who consider themselves good and sincere Catholics and are listening to the opposition of the Pope, they are driven towards the counter-revolution. A counter-revolution can claim that they are acting on behalf of the true faith and God, and that results in more radical individuals, in particular ultra-radicals in Paris. That pushes them to adopt harsher measures against the clergy, even those members of the clergy that was supporting the revolution. And this becomes a cycle which feeds on itself again and again and again until you end up with a situation like the de-Christianization campaign in late 1793, the closure of churches across the country, curtailment of public worship, and things like extrajudicial killings of priests. Many priests are deported. Other priests don't have the luxury of a trial. There's instances, for example, in Western France of mass drownings of priests that are just carted onto boats and deliberately sunk. And eventually you end up in a situation where you get state-sponsored cults to try to replace what the radicals consider to be the kind of superstition or fanaticism of Catholicism. And so, in a nutshell, religion is not a cause of the French Revolution, but just like the English Revolution, it is a big driver of instability, of destabilization, of radicalization. That is a key similarity, even though they have different starting points.
Which brings us to the next question, I suppose, is how far the respective regimes' religious policies played into the end of the revolutions under Monk and Napoleon. And from what you're saying, would I suggest that Napoleon partly happens because somebody has got to re-establish some sort of stability into all this religious chaos, or am I jumping ahead?
By the time Napoleon rises to power, much of some of these religious issues, the kind of turbulent nature of them, these religious debates become proxy wars amongst the revolutionaries themselves. That has settled down a little bit. So as it relates to Napoleon's rise, what I would say is that the issues and debates around religion, they help to create the environment, the unrest, the dissatisfaction that helps to foster a military coup. Why Napoleon is the person that succeeds is not really due to a religion. He is not at the head of some Catholic uprising that is going to restore the true faith. He is successful because of his military exploits, because of an amazing propaganda machine. He somehow spins Egypt into a victory when it's really quite a disaster. He is personally ambitious. There's a whole bunch of factors that makes Napoleon who he is and why he's successful. And religion is kind of a secondary situation. So it creates the general environment in which someone could seize power. But the fact that Napoleon is the individual that seizes power, there are other factors at play that are far more important than these religious tensions, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think it's similar in England, actually. Obviously, it's still there. And the Presbyterians, who are the biggest sector apart from the Anglicans, in general, never supported the death of the king. You can't be hard and fast about this because there would have been Presbyterians who were Republicans. There would have been Anglicans who were Republicans. So there's nothing hard and fast, but by and large, the Presbyterians and Anglicans had never accepted the execution of the king, and they hated the chaos of religious toleration that Cromwell and the independents bring in. But what really causes the chaos is the refusal of the Republicans, this new tradition, this new creed, as it were, refused to accept the Constitution, the idea of a single person and a second house, the ancient Constitution revived almost. That really causes the breakup. But religion is obviously still a factor.
So I suppose then on the topic of the ancient Constitution revived, we do have a great question that came in that relates to which revolution came closest to achieving its goals on both a short term and a long term. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, when you look at the English Revolution, how would you evaluate its success, both in its immediate future and then on the longer time frame?
Fascinating question. Of course, one of the big problems is what were the aims that was never stated. And I think a point which I'll probably come back to again and again, a slightly dull way, if I'm honest. English is the first. There's no roadmap. There's no set of political ideas being floating around in the ether as to what they wanted. But essentially, I would say the initial aim of the revolutionaries in England was not to be revolution, was just to restore what they thought of as the ancient constitution and the limits upon the powers of the king that entailed, while Charles's aim was to restore the ancient constitution and the absolute rights of the king that entailed. So it's slightly frustrating. And of course, in the short term, that kind of fails, but it doesn't really. And it's in 1688, which is only 30 years later, that all gets restored and there is a limited constitution, which is pretty much exactly, I'd have said, what the revolutionists were trying to impose. Limits on the king. You know, it succeeds in a session, and in 1701, the Act of Succession ends the idea of absolute divine hereditary right, because it chooses not the Stuart. It chooses some ancient Hanoverian lady. Parliament decides who succeeds is the outcome of that, not God. It doesn't take long for the revolution to succeed afterwards.
It's fascinating because the French Revolution is very different, and obviously it's very turbulent, and anyone knows anything not only about the French Revolution, but just French history in the 19th century and how many variations of monarchies, empires, republics that you get. I mean, there's a reason why the first French Republic is in 1792, and we're currently on the fifth French Republic. what I would say with the French Revolution is that you kind of need to look at two separate revolutions. There's the initial revolution of 1789 that sees an absolute monarchy become a constitutional monarchy, and then a few years later, a second revolution that sees the constitutional monarchy become a republic. And if I start with the first one, the constitution that gets created and the constitutional kind of regime that gets set up to place limits on Louis XVI, that constitution is in effect for less than a year. So if I'm evaluating the short-term success of these endeavors, they failed pretty miserably. If their goal was to create a constitutional monarchy, it's a disastrous outcome. If I think about the Republican phase, it lasts longer, but it definitely falls well short of the Republic of Virtue that many revolutionaries were aspiring to create, particularly as it is plagued by corruption and internal repression. The Constitution of 1793, the first Republican Constitution, it's never properly implemented, and liberties and freedoms are trampled during the so-called Reign of Terror. So in the short term, both the initial constitutional monarchy and then the revolution for the republic, they largely fail their objectives, and I can't describe really either as successful, despite the fact that they are making meaningful and long-lasting reforms in addition to what they're up to. Over the longer term, you can be a lot more generous. Post-1789, the norm becomes constitutional government. Even when the monarchy is restored after Napoleon, there must be a charter. So if you think about, at a high level what the goal was, which was to introduce a constitution for France and to place constitutional limits on the king, over the longer term, that is successful. If I think about the modern Fifth Republic compared to the goals of the First Republic over the longer term, again, there are many objectives that have been achieved. Universal suffrage, separation of church and state, a much larger welfare state and funds for universal education and the like. These are explicit goals from the First Republic. There are still shortcomings, sure, wealth inequality and low political participation in some ways, but over the longer term, I think that you can make the case that some of the key ideas of both the era for constitutional monarchy and the Republican era have been achieved on a long enough time frame.
Yeah, it's interesting, of course. I could give a more complicated answer for England too, actually, about the longer term. If I take on the aims that emerge, the Levellers and the agreement of the people, even the two subsequent constitutions. But I agree. We never go back to republicanism. So that was never achieved. But of course, that wasn't part of the original aims anyway. Yeah. So talking about constitutions then, what somebody else also asked, interesting question, which was, which of the various constitutions had the best chance of working, given the limitations of the eras where they were drafted? How does that play out? What do you think about in terms of France?
The problem here is France has so many constitutions. I'm going to stick to the two that I've kind of been referencing. So the initial constitution of 1791, which is for the constitutional monarchy, and then the constitution of 1793, which comes 2 years later for the First Republic.
I mean, that's typical of the French, isn't it? You just can't, it's typical of the French, all this all over the place, Come on, settle down.
Exactly. Well, the problem is that their first attempt, the constitutional monarchy of 1791, it's a monstrosity. And I've got a whole episode where I just kind of tear into it. But in a nutshell, it is too republican to work for a monarchy, and it's too monarchical to work for a republic. And it is riddled with a high-minded idealism and internal contradictions, and it kind of encourages dysfunction and deadlock in the way that it treats the power of the king, his relationship between him and his ministers and the legislative assembly, the elected assembly. It's also got all sorts of contradictions around the democratic principles which underpin it. Theoretically, this is an age of liberty and equality and all men are born equal, but then they don't turn around and give universal male suffrage. They say, oh yes, all men are equal, but only men that pay a specific amount of taxes should have the right to vote. And this is one of the many issues that you get with this constitution. And I would also point out, because I noted that there was a link here to some of the demands of the Levellers. What happens with the Constitution of 1791 is that the deputies that draft it in the initial National Assembly, they introduce something called the Self-Denying Ordinance. And what that means is that the men who crafted this constitution cannot be elected into like the first legislative assembly, and they cannot become ministers of the king after they leave office, at least for a little while. And what that means is that everyone who has just gone through the experience of crafting this constitution cannot actually help to implement the new order. And if you think about it, this is entirely different from, say, the approach that the Americans are taking at the same time, where many of their presidents and cabinet secretaries are founding fathers. And so the Constitution of 1791, as I said, it lasts less than a year. It never had a hope. The Constitution of 1793 on the Republican side, it's actually never implemented because by now we're in the reign of terror and it's too discredited by the time that ends. It's also full of contradictions, especially tensions between direct democracy and representative democracy. It's kind of this weird middle house that's trying to appease Republican moderates to prevent a civil war, as well as Parisian ultra-radicals. And I would say it's more of a statement of principles than a functioning framework. Would it have lasted longer than a year? Would it have beaten the Constitution of 1791? Obviously, we don't know. I think it's likely, but was it a recipe for long-term success? No, it absolutely wasn't. So my answer to this question of which constitutions had the best chance of working, whatever the English were up to, it's got to be better, because these constitutions, I know that you go through quite a bit of change yourself on your end, but the constitutions that the French create are just not particularly, as I said, one of them fails after a year, the other one is never actually implemented. I think that says a lot.
It's quite an interesting debate, isn't it? Because, of course, ever since I was on my mother's milk, I was given the idea that the French Revolution established, these fantastic constitutions which were subverted by the tyrant Napoleon, tyrant and bloodthirsty, destroyer of worlds, Napoleon. And it's interesting that your attitude is interesting, that it weren't practical. And one of the interesting things about the party debates, actually, is that the way people should look at that is it's an interesting debate. Not only does it have very radical ideas, but actually they're trying to think of how to make it work. So they end up rejecting the idea of universal male suffrage because they're like, well, that's never going to work. In actual fact, you've got to have this thing where people are going to vote if they've got a stake in the country. So it's quite interesting that you're dissing it when, I've always seen it as this, big, fantastic thing that showed us the way forward to modernity. Anyway, there you go. I don't think Mother's Milk should really come into any podcast on history, and I'd like to formally apologise for that. Now, where were we? Oh, yes. So we have 3 constitutions. I'll try and be brief. The agreement of the people, which never becomes a constitution. There's nobody to fight for it. It's far too radical. But the exciting thing about it is all these new ideas that have not been around since antiquity, even if then, the idea of natural rights, above and beyond any power of Parliament to change, such as religious toleration, the wider suffrage, all these fantastic ideas. But they're too early. Nobody agrees with all this. Nobody agrees with the idea of equality, that people are in estates and that's the way it is, So it really had no chance of winning, and there was nobody left to fight for it because there are other important things going on. So that was that. Then I've also thought it's very fascinating that though one of the very few countries in the world, I think there are only 3 of us who don't have a written constitution, Britain, has one of the very first written constitutions. There's one earlier one, the Instruments of Government in Sweden, I think, and there may be another one, but basically one of the world's first constitutions, the Instruments of Government of 1653, thoroughly sensible, but it brings back the idea of a single person. And now republicanism have fanatics. The last 4 years have established people now absolutely wedded, like Henry Martin, to the idea of a republic, no single person ruled by a council. And they never accept the idea of a single person. So then we get the third, which is the Humble Petition of Advice in 1657, which is the only constitution which was actually voted through by Parliament. And that is the ancient constitution without the hereditary sacral principle and with a greater degree of religious toleration. And that had a real chance of succeeding if the damn Republicans, had agreed to compromise and play a longer game. Could have worked. And if Cromwell had lasted longer, could have worked. Doesn't, because that factionalism carries on. So in the end, it doesn't work and we never have a constitution again.
Those damn Republicans, huh?
Damn Republicans say, hey, well, obviously I'm on their side, but, they could have played the longer game. Just wait a little while. Sacral monarchy is gone. Just relax, guys. Well, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the different aims of revolutionary groups and trying to kind of just get that little bit more of what they're after ends up resulting in frameworks that either don't work or can't be implemented or don't have sufficient buy-in from enough of a coalition across society that it can actually kind of bed down and act as a solid foundation. And I suppose this leads us actually really well to the next question, because what we're talking about here is the inability of these revolutionary regimes to implement some of the values that they had championed years before. And we had a question from a listener, and this listener quoted historian David Starkey, who states that revolutions reproduce the worst aspects of the regimes they replace. And the listener wanted to know what are some of the examples from our two revolutions where the new regimes replicate the faults of the old or perhaps even exceed them. Do you want to take this one first, David? I mean, I can think of quite a few examples that you might bring to mind in terms of the crimes of Charles I that get replicated in various ways.
It's interesting. I kind of disagree with David Starkey because the context is always different. I think they create their own crimes, to be honest, their own, worst aspects of the regime. On toleration, the protectorate is always better until you get the Glorious Revolution. On censorship, there's quite a lot of backsliding, but it never gets back the High Commission and the Star Chamber. And so it's unable to implement censorship anything like the same scale as Charles I. But it invents its own horrors. So moral reformation, the rule of the major generals, the level of repression in Ireland by Charles Fleetwood and chums and the army until Henry Cromwell comes along, begins to moderate. But even so, the level of repression and land grab in Ireland is way worse than anything the Stuarts did. And it creates its own evils of rule by the army, which will be a key factor in British politics for the next couple of hundred years. But the interesting thing is that in 1658, January 1658, there was no way back for the monarchy. The monarchy was gone. History, we are no longer a monarchy. That's it. It's all over. The people shouting, the fat ladies trying to sing, but, it's gone. And yet, 2 years later, it's back because of that factionalist and absolute unwillingness for anybody to compromise. So I disagree with David Starkey. I think they create their own nastiness. Taxation, for example, is far higher, whether that's a good or a bad thing, at the end of the protectorate than ever Charles could have dreamt of. So that's a terrible answer, isn't it? But that is my answer.
I agree with you that Starkey's premise, for me, at least as it relates to the constitutional monarchy, I don't think that in the years between 1789 and 1792 that the new constitutional regime is simply replicating the worst aspects of the old regime. I think you need to kind of want to make that argument. I mean, you could make that argument in the sense of the dysfunction that the regime creates. I certainly think you could make that argument maybe in its tendency to go start international wars on very vague grounds like glory and honor. So you can make the argument, but I think, in general, if I look at the old regime and the constitutional monarchy, if I look at the inequality, the injustice, the lack of personal freedoms, I don't think that era is replicating the worst aspects. Having said that, I think Starkey's line rings a lot truer when we get to the Republican era, especially those initial years in 1792, 93, 94. That's a very different kettle of fish. If you think about the common criticisms of the old regime, the arbitrary arrests, the uneven justice, the censorship, the trampling of a range of individual rights, including freedom of expression, freedom of religion, property rights, presumption of innocence, the list goes on. And under the reign of terror, or if I was to be a bit more generous, the era of revolutionary government, these abuses are often more severe than they had been under the monarchy. Now, there's good reason for this. France is besieged. It's got multiple civil wars. It's got foreign wars on all its land and maritime borders. There's reasons why things are worse. But that doesn't change the fact that the level of repression is far more extreme and individual liberties have been curtailed to a far greater extent in many ways than they had been under the old regime. Now, that's not a universal, I wouldn't say Starkey's line that all of the worst aspects are replicated. I mean, the French Republic does abolish slavery, for example, but as a general rule, I think that his line doesn't hold true to the constitutional monarchy, but it does hold true, at least for the initial years of the Republic, which then I suppose ends up getting back to dysfunction and corruption and some of the initial criticisms of the old regime in different regards.
Actually, on one minor point, it's worth saying Cromwell absolutely reproduces the faults of Charles in dissolving parliaments, although that was his job, and indeed Charles's job. But just like Charles, he struggles to get on with the parliaments that disagree with him. So for his point of view, because he's more tolerant than the parliaments are by and large. But anyway, so there is one thing I could give David Starkey his star for.
Fair enough. So I suppose we have hit perhaps with the most amount of questions that we got was on the topic we're about to go to next, which are the similarities and differences between these two great revolutions. And, I think it makes sense for people to want to understand where there are parallels, where there's divergence, because these are two monumental events that often get compared to one another. So I suppose, David, would you like to go first? We've obviously discussed religion to an extent already, but as it relates to other topics, would you like to start with a similarity or difference of your choice?
So I started off by thinking the dissimilarities are way greater than the similarities. And I think I probably stuck with that. But there are some very important similarities. So money, all about money. If Charles had had Cromwell's income, the Protectorate's income, he'd have crushed the Scots in 1637. We wouldn't be having this conversation probably. The English monarchy, the British monarchy, was radically underfunded, had been for years, and Parliament refused to accept that was the case. And that is the root cause of the problem. So money, and you talked about, the French being a bankruptcy crisis. So my first thing is money. Why don't you do a similarity?
I might cheekily give you a difference instead, because I agree that a fiscal crisis, the inability of the kings to raise the taxation that they require for different reasons, but an inability to raise sufficient taxation is a key similarity. But a difference is that economic crisis that we were talking about earlier. And the French, amongst other issues, they have had terrible harvests. They've had bad weather more broadly as well. And this creates a doubling of bread prices. This then feeds into the economy in all sorts of ways. And the French Revolution, throughout the entirety of the revolution, has these economic crises which are creating all sorts of problems. And it is no coincidence that at almost every major event that you get in the French Revolution, and particularly in Paris, it is sky-high bread prices. It feeds into everything. And it also it emerges in other ways. You have hyperinflation for a period of time. You have shortages in all sorts of basic goods and commodities. Some of it is, of course, self-inflicted, but this economic crisis is a big difference that manifests in different ways. And I suppose if I cheekily can sneak in a second difference between two groups that are often compared to one another, if you think about the sans-culottes and you think about the levelers, not the diggers, but the levelers, their economic policies, their economic manifestos, if you like, are very different. The sans-culottes are dealing into these economic crises, so they are far more collectivist in approach. They are after price maximums, price controls, not only on the cost of goods, but also wages. They are interested in all sorts of laws against speculation and hoarding. And if you go look at the manifestos produced by the levelers, they are champions of private property rights. And so this economic issue is a significant difference between the English and French revolutions and manifests in significant differences between groups that people often draw parallels between.
To build on that in another dissimilarity is the reason why people are, generally speaking, not allowed to call it the English Revolution, apart from the fact that it's clearly interconnected between the three kingdoms, is that there is very little social radicalism here. Nobody wants to recreate a new society. They want it better regulated with more liberties for people and freedoms, but they don't want to change the estates of man. There is none of that. So that's a key difference to me, which makes, we're going to come on to the radicalism question, which makes, for me, and I think most people, the English Revolution much less deeply radical than the French.
On the topic of kind of the radical nature of the revolutions, though, I do have a similarity which I'd like to throw out there, which is how the radicalization of a armed group, particularly a group that's well represented in the capital, can really drive the broader revolution forward. This manifests in different ways. So if I think about England, obviously you have the new model army and everything to do with Pride's Purge and the trial of the king and the like. In France, the army does not play anywhere near the same role that it has. But what you do have in France, at least initially, is a new revolutionary militia known as the Parisian National Guard. And later on, you get the famous sans-culottes, which is, if I really simplify this, let's call them kind of like the militant wing of like a proto-working class. And the sans-culottes and the National Guard will start to become, those distinctions start to break down as the revolution continues, particularly in the Republican era. And in both cases, you have these well-coordinated and radical groups that are imposing their agenda on the elected legislative bodies, be it parliament or the various French assemblies, and conducting things like purges of elected deputies or elected members of parliament. And so for me, this is a key similarity where the revolutions are perhaps pushed much further than where the average citizen may be in their personal views because of a well-coordinated and well-armed group in the respective capitals.
Yeah, I think that's very true. The importance of the capital is also very strong, I think, very similar. I think it also leads on to other similarities, which neither group set out to create a republic. For both groups, they had a desire, though, to make a better world. And the engine to do that was a written constitution, which is a new idea. Both of them, it's less new in France, but, both of them said, right, we've got to write this down. We've got to regularize it, and we've got to live our lives by these set of agreed principles. So although there are far fewer radical, the radicalism is less in English, it still constitutes a major change in society which people were aiming for, and they thought it was important mechanism was to write it down. So there's sort of a similarity there. And if I segue quickly into another similarity before you can open your mouth, because, my podcasts are crying out loud. For both, external factors are very important. I mean, external factors for England in terms of Ireland and Scotland in particular, but also France plays its part, and indeed Spain and the Netherlands. The international situation is important, or the external situation is very important. And that's clearly out of thought true for the French.
Yeah, so I would say that it's even more so for the French. I mean, at least from my perspective, if I look at the War of the Three Kingdoms, there is a significant amount of it that is conflict kind of within and between the kingdoms of the Stuart dynasty, or the realms of the Stuart kings. And so the French, I think comparatively, yes, they have civil wars, including a very notable civil war in Western France, but the French will find themselves at war with, at a single time, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, the Dutch Republic, multiple Italian states, Spain, Portugal, eventually like Russia gets into it. Like, you have foreign armies that are not only on French soil, but you've got multiple borders breached at any one time. The Prussians do start to get pretty close to Paris at one point. So for me, that foreign dynamic is incredibly important. And I do think there's a bit of a difference in the extent of that foreign element. But that also leads me to a similarity as well, which is just how important war is in these conflicts. And that creates similarities and differences in itself. The new model army is the new army. Like, there's all sorts of military reforms that come with this. There is similarities in the level of violence and how much of the needs of the state are kind of subordinated to the needs of the army and the needs of military victory. But there's also differences as well. The French are, I think, the foreign war is more important to them than the civil wars, where, obviously the English, they are in military engagements with the Spanish and the Dutch and the like, but by and large, it's kind of the war within and between, the three kingdoms that theoretically all have the same king.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And linked to that, actually, is in the English Revolution, there is no real desire to export this revolution. Certainly not in terms of the ideas. I know there's a war against Spain, but that's really a continuation of the Elizabethan War against Spain. And there's a little interesting wrinkle of the involvement in the Fronde in Bordeaux in 1650s when Edward Sexby gets sent over and takes the Agrément de Peuple with him. But basically, there's no desire to export, which brings me on to another question, actually, which I'm going to sneak in. So, the English narrative as a British narrative has always been about, Napoleon, destroyer of worlds. The French Revolution exported their revolution and took the war. They declared war on the Austrians for starters. And then they say, we need to convert the rest of Europe to these great new truths we found. And that's the main cause of the Napoleonic wars, as Napoleon's such glory. Whereas on our Facebook site, there was this idea suggested that, in actual fact, no, that's not true. Probably the Napoleonic Wars wouldn't have been necessary without British interference in French affairs. Discuss, Will.
What a simple question that you've got there for me, David.
Yeah, look, you've got 10 seconds. No, don't fashion it in. Don't worry about it.
In a nutshell, I mean, yes, the French revolutionaries actively export their ideology to, well, they want to topple, and they make this very clear, they want to topple every throne in Europe. And so they are going to export the revolution at the point of a bayonet. And yes, okay, so by the time you get to the end of the War of the First Coalition, then you get Napoleon's takeover. I suppose if the guts of the question is, once Napoleon takes power in France and starts to consolidate the situation in France, if the pesky British hadn't been funding all these wars, would we still get, the Napoleonic Wars? I think we just get them in different flavor. Without the British, I don't think they would be as sizable, but, there are other great powers sitting at the table here. Austria is very unhappy with the settlement of the War of the First Coalition. They, at some point in time, are going to want to rewrite those treaties with a sword. There are other powers as well that have their nose out of joint. How much Britain is really going to sit on its hands when it views France as this ancient rival that it has been in conflict for centuries? We are in a period of time that some historians refer to as the Second 100 Years' War. So, do I think we still get some sort of Napoleonic Wars? Yes, especially with the fact that you've got Napoleon in charge. He's not exactly a sit-on-his-hands kind of guy. And likewise, I don't think that there's appetite in the halls of Parliament in the UK to just let the French and the Austrians, say, go at it and result in an even further French victory and kind of, an export of their power over the continent. So I think we're going to end up with some flavour of Napoleonic Wars, even if the Brits are sitting out a little bit more. I struggle to see a world where conflict ends in the late 1790s.
Well, next question we had was about the way the revolutions go. So the question is, why did the French Revolution encounter such difficult headwinds in terms of it ate its own children, was the phrase used in the question. Why was the English Revolution comparatively more stable? I've never really thought of the English Revolution as comparatively more stable. Eating children. Will, over to you.
So that line, just for context, there is a deputy that warns that the revolution will replicate Saturn, which is a reference to ancient mythology, and kind of devour its own children. And the revolution does do that. If I think about the National Convention, almost a third of deputies are arrested at some point in time between 1792 and 1795. Almost 10% will die from one means or another. So it is a revolution that is famous for killing its most prominent members. As to why the French Revolution becomes what it becomes, that is a question that historians have spent an enormous amount of ink trying to answer, and there is absolutely no consensus. I would offer just a few quick kind of highlights, I suppose, of that debate. The first thing that you need to understand is that the war is critical. The war begins in April 1792, just a few months before the fall of the monarchy. It is disastrous from the start. That discredits the pro-war revolutionaries, and it also discredits the monarchy, who is suspected of aiding the enemy, most notably the Austrians and the Prussians. And as I said, these military defeats helped to lead to the violent overthrow of the monarchy, and this process helps to reveal to the French people just how many people have been secretly betraying them. They have evidence that the king is secretly communicating with foreign monarchs. Lafayette, one of the great heroes of the initial years of the Revolution and a hero of the American Revolution, he attempts a coup to reverse the overthrow of the monarchy. Lafayette's replacement is a guy named de Maurier. He is initially considered the savior of the Republic for stopping the Prussian advance. He attempts a coup only a few months later. And you have other statesmen like Mirabeau, who was considered a champion of the people, and as part of the overthrow of the monarchy, secret documents reveal his double dealings as well. And so what you have with the war and what comes from it is military crises, as well as repeated instances of heroes being exposed as traitors. And you add on to this an atmosphere in the French Revolution of a culture that's kind of defined or obsessed by plots and conspiracies. And political leaders are starting to lose trust with their longtime friends and allies. They're suspicious of people that they even invited to their own wedding. And so all of a sudden, everyone is suspected of either secretly wishing to reinstall the monarchy, or to see themselves as a new Cromwell, or to enrich themselves through corruption through their political power. And so you have this, not only this military crisis, but this belief that no one can be trusted. Even the people that you thought were friends and men of virtue might actually be lying to you. Add on to that, the French have no history of kind of like parliamentary representative democracy or the like. And so what they don't really have a good grasp of, and it seems so odd in hindsight because of the societies that we live in, but they don't really have this grasp yet that people could represent the views of their constituents and have opposing views. So there's this idea that people are representing the will of the people. But if you have two individuals that say they're representing the will of the people and their views are polar opposite, then actually that person at best is misled. But actually, given everything else, they're probably a foreign agent. They're probably working for the royalists. They're probably, their intentions are, and it's not just that they're wrong, it's that they are betraying the people. And so all of this kind of comes together, and you add in issues around structural weakness, as I said before, the hunger crises, economic crises, destabilizing factors around the sheer size and scope of the revolutionary agenda. And all of a sudden, as the war gets worse and worse, and as civil war starts to break out, then, you have grounds to suspect everyone. And because they've killed Louis, then the only treatment that they have for these people that they are accusing of treason must also be death. You couldn't possibly kill Louis XVI and then spare elected deputies. The revolution starts to consume itself. Now, for some historians, they also point to the fact that the revolution's underlying ideology is inherently violent, it's inherently unstable. It was always going to result in the terror, even from 1789. Other historians would vehemently disagree with that and mainly point to the war and the situation that the war creates. But as I said, historians have spent an awful lot of time debating this, but I think that gives you a sense of how different factors around this environment of paranoia and fear and suspicion meets with a military crisis, meets with unrest and hunger and the like, and all of a sudden you get all these things that come together to create a perfect storm.
Very interesting. I mean, fascinating topic there. So I've been much briefer with English. I don't quite know. For me, you've said one of these, that the respect of Parliament is incredibly strong, and therefore there was a forum where people think these things should be worked through. And even throughout Cromwell's years, he never tries to rule without Parliament. He keeps having parliaments. And secondly, the stakes were so much lower in the English Revolution. There wasn't all this rampant inequality was far less. Social mobility was far higher. There was no famine. There were, the economic reasons weren't there. There was no external war. So all those things were less powerful. And throughout it, everybody keeps saying, oh, this is awful. This is awful. Nobody's celebrating the change. They think this is terrible. We need to get back to where we were when everything was cuddly and we all had teddy bears. They're constantly doing that. Nobody's rollicking. Very few people are rollicking in the change. A few people, but really, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things in our discussions that has become apparent is just how different these revolutions are, even though that they have parallels. Well, they do have a range of similarities and they do have parallels, especially on the surface as well. They are very different beasts. And that's part of the reason why not only their cause, but also, I suppose, the kind of the middle chapters, if you like, do develop in very different ways.
Which brings us to the next question, which was, for me, was the most interesting one that I want to hear you give me the answer. So quite a few people asked the questions of how much influence you think the British Revolution was on the French, whether the leaders of the French Revolution were inspired by the English one. Can we quantify the degree of influence? Were there any positive references, inspirations from the English Revolution? So I'm really interested in this. Will, go.
So I think the overall influence of the English Revolution on the French is probably less than is commonly assumed, and much of it's indirect. I mean, yes, Britain is held up as an example amongst reformers before they even know that there's going to be a revolution. Britain is held up as an example of constitutional monarchy, but it's not the only example that's championed. You've got to remember that some of the French revolutionaries are actively involved in the American Revolutionary War, and many of the French intellectual elite are looking over as America as an example. They see Britain as corrupted and not necessarily representing a lot of the values from the Enlightenment. And that's another factor. Yes, again, the British example is looked upon positively by many French Enlightenment thinkers. But there are many thinkers in the Enlightenment, and, the British example is, there's a whole bunch of ideas that the French are drawing upon, and it's not just the British parliamentary system. And I think the proof as to why this positive influence, if you like, is actually relatively limited occurs in late 1789, when the revolutionaries kind of have established themselves after the fall of the Bastille, and they can start to draft a constitution. And when the French actually start to draft the constitution, they look at the English model and bin it. They run in the opposite direction. They're not going to have a House of Lords. They're not going to let the King's ministers be members of the Legislative Assembly. They're not going to allow the King to appoint a whole series of positions. They're going to be elected. They look at the British constitutional model and they see in it all sorts of inequalities and corruptions and distortions of the people's will, and create something that is quite different, not only from the British model, but also from what many of the American states, as well as, the American federal government has established as well. And so to me, I think that's, it kind of goes back to what we were discussing with the trial of Charles and Louis, where the French in many ways are looking over at the English and going, here's what we're not going to do. I think you could argue it was a mistake doing that, and certainly that's what Edmund Burke argues. The influence is there, but I think it's limited. And the final point I would make is that these revolutions are very different. If you think about the English Revolution, you've got religious issues with Scotland and the like. That results then in a broader civil war. And then only after that do you get a revolution. Where the French, you start off with a bankruptcy, then you get a revolution, then you get foreign war and some religious tensions before another revolution, and only then do you get to a civil war. Like they're very different in their structure and their causes. And that limits the kind of applicability, if you like, of what lessons you can take. So in short, yes, there is definitely a positive impact and influence and indirect source of inspiration from aspects of the British constitutional model. But the French are not taking notes and going, this is what we need to replicate. That's not the case at all.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think it's quite interesting. It's quite depressing, actually, when you try and trace the influence of the English Revolution in England, in Britain. It's actually quite hard work. So the thing that we would like to think, that, these leveler ideas and digger ideas of democracy and communality and, blah, 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 start a movement. Really not true. Shaftesbury carries on the green ribbon thing around the levelers for a little while. You can argue that the English Revolution inspires Locke, who is one of the fathers of the Enlightenment, but it's a little bit tangential. So yes, I mean, I agree. I think people, there are lots of impacts of the English Revolution in Britain, but they tend to be not about let's have democracy, which we would like them to be. They're things like religious pluralism is here to stay, the king can be killed, and therefore you've got to watch that again, and so on and so forth. But actually that leads us on, in a sense, to the next question, which is, to what extent did the French understanding of the 1688-1689 rebellion, the Glorious Revolution, how did that influenced France. Is your answers presumably pretty much the same?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. I think what's really impacting the French far more than the British examples is actually the Enlightenment. And so there's a whole bunch of ideas that come out of the English Civil War that feed, as you say, into various Enlightenment thinkers on both sides of the Channel and across the continent. But the French really aren't doing a kind of play-by-play reading of English history and going, this is the lesson, this is what's right or wrong. It's much bigger than that. And it's a bit more of a butterfly effect where ideas are coming through the Enlightenment. You know, we've got to keep in mind that even with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, that is 100 years before the French Revolution. It is a very long time. No one has lived that experience or the like. And so, again, the impact of all the mid-1600s in England, from the 1640s towards the 1670s, the impact, I think, is relatively indirect, and it is impactful, but not in people just reading the history books and going, "This is the problem." With the exception of, certainly there are aspects that are much more literal, like the trial of Charles I, or how do we avoid a Cromwell dictatorship. Those examples are being discussed, but even then, they're being discussed in relation to. Like if you read the debates of the French Revolution, it's like you can play ancient Rome and ancient Greece bingo, and you can barely go a couple of hours without other history being referenced. And so England is only part of a much broader conversation of historical references and learnings.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is quite interesting that the Glorious Revolution in particular does codify some of this into a Bill of Rights with a limitation of king's power, of the separation of power between king and judiciary, the idea of a certain level of religious toleration. So there is some of that, but I agree, it's all at one remove. It's influences the Enlightenment. And one of the big differences in the English Revolution is the Enlightenment hasn't happened. This is all new. There's no roadmap, as I said. So agreed. And I think we had another couple of questions. So Louis XVI had benefit of hindsight. He knew what happened to Charles I. I think you've already covered that, actually, earlier in the trial. And then how did the Brits explain away their revolution during the 1790s? Why didn't we say, oh, yeah, this is what we should have done first time? You've answered the question about did they French look at 1640s and 50s as a model, and said no, basically agree. So how did the Brits explain it away? Why did we suddenly start getting all so antsy about the French Revolution? And I think we've come back to Burke, don't we? That he's feeling that we had a constitution which had evolved, which reflected the spirit of the people and was continuing to reflect that populist sovereignty, that idea which had come up in the first English Revolution. Populist sovereignty was actually being reflected in an organic process and growing, and that there was bound to be violence if you just tried to write it down in one set of paper, because people are always things are going to change and people are going to disagree and all the rest of it. And of course, he was absolutely right. The French Revolution did blow up, and, changing constitutions is very tricky. So I think we explained it away because we thought, in the petite English arrogant fashion, we've got it right. Obviously, the Chartists would change all that, but.
Yeah, and to go further, Burke kind of ends up with these really interesting kind of theoretical arguments where the French are basing their constitutions off natural rights. Burke is proposing these ideas known as like ancient rights, and that these are kind of slow incremental change based on what's been accepted, like the inherited wisdom of your ancestors. And of course, there's contradictions in this. Burke doesn't really try to explain where these ancient rights come from, and there's other issues. But on this point of how the Brits kind of explain away their revolution when they're looking at the French Revolution and horror, the last time I made an appearance on the History of England podcast, I kind of got into this explicit question around British reactions to the French Revolution. So that's a whole episode, and I would definitely check that out to get into the nuts and bolts of why Burke crafted an argument that would simultaneously let him defend English history and the English approach while also raining on the parade of the French, which, as you say, David, there's many criticisms of Burke's work, but his predictions on the fact that the French Revolution will devour itself and fail, he is on the money.
Yes, it's an excellent episode. You should absolutely go. I'll repost it actually when we've done this. So we've kind of reached the end, amazingly. I reflect actually, in the way that every revolution is flawed, the very idea of a podcast as Q&A is deeply flawed. It has the seeds of its own destruction in it because podcasters like to talk. Anyway, I mean, it's impossible. That's why we do it, because we like the sound of our own voices. And so we've gone on for hours. Anyway, have we agreed that we would kind of sum up and have our top 3 similarities and top 3 dissimilarities? So, you first.
Oh, God, this is the part where I confessed that I haven't actually come up with a solid list. So I think the top 3 similarities, I think the fiscal crisis has to be one. The need for the monarchs to raise taxes and how that then opens up Pandora's box as to, well, what is actually the prerogatives and the power of the king versus an elected assembly and the constitutional arrangements of that. So I think that's one clear similarity. Another similarity, I think, is the importance of war in shaping these revolutions and defining their quite violent characteristics at times. And a third top similarity would be, you know what, I'll go back to what I was saying before, where a well-armed and well-coordinated radical minority can push the revolution to a far greater extent than actually what many people are comfortable with, particularly in this case where both nations have such a metropolis for a capital where the role of London and particularly the role of Paris is just so pronounced over their respective kingdoms. And yourself, David?
Yes, I'm going to agree with all of those similarities, and I'm not going to argue with any of them or introduce some new ones, particularly about the money one. So I'll do dissimilarities then, and you can see how much you argue with those. My dissimilarities, first of all, start off with the Enlightenment. And one of the really exciting things about the English Revolution, actually, and it doesn't happen in the same way in Scotland and Ireland, is they're starting from scratch. There's no roadmap. They're making it up as they go along, and the profusion of ideas that comes out of the revolution is the most thrilling thing out, from Gerald Winstanley and the Common Treasury all the way through to natural rights, popular sovereignty of the people. All this fantastic stuff. I didn't go anywhere, obviously, but so that would be my first big dissimilarity. The level of social revolution, I think, is critical to how it all turns out. There isn't that critical bite to it. And then finally, the influence of religion is absolutely different in the English Revolution.
I would agree with all of that. I know we said top 3, but I would add into that the economic crises and the way that permeates a rejection of all sorts of values. Even initially in the French Revolution, they're abandoning the kind of old way of doing things in the monarchy and introducing quite radical ideas around private property rights and freedom of trade and the like. And that all gets binned a few years later because of the economic crises and how that powers further instability and rebellion in Paris. So that's a key difference I would also add.
Great. Are we done then, Will? Can we finally release our poor listeners? Have we delighted them enough?
Well, I think we can. And, I think everyone still has their heads. David, thank you so much for helping to make this Q&A possible. It has been fantastic. For the benefit of my listeners, do you want to maybe just give a quick summary of what you're doing over at, admittedly, the relatively self-explanatory, the history of England, but perhaps maybe explain the sheer size and scale of what you're up to over there?
Oh, well, we're doing a sort of soup to nuts history of England. We are currently at 1660. I've taken a pause just because, I wanted to. But we're getting back on with the later Stuarts very soon, in a couple of months' time. And Will, equally, let all my listeners know, although you've been on the programme already, actually, did that fantastic episode on Burke, which was brilliant, actually. Yes, you want to tell my listeners what it is you're about?
It's also pretty self-explanatory. The French Revolution and Napoleon by Grey History. We are, in a very similar manner, slowly, chronologically working our way through the French Revolution. We are in the height of the terror at the moment, so there's plenty to catch up on, and it's all happening. And if you're looking for a long-form history to sink your teeth into, by all means, come check it out.
And I think actually one thing to add to that, if I may, there is a commonality between us, Will, which comes out of your name, Grey Histories, which is that we both believe these things, history is all incredibly nuanced. There is no right or wrong. It's very difficult to find rights and wrongs. Obviously, there are some. And that's the excitement of history, getting inside the heads of the people and their attitudes from the past, rather than going back and saying, look, this is the way they should have been. Aren't they awful? So I think we both believe it, love it, the complexity and nuance of history, do we not?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, history, as the reason why it's called great history. History isn't black and white. It's full of ambiguity. It's full of nuance. And, as I like to say, we've got no shortage of problems we need to solve in the 21st century. And so we might as well try to learn some of the lessons of the past. And if we're to do that successfully, then we need to understand the contradicting experiences and conclusions, not only of contemporaries, but also of historians as well, and why people look at the same events or experience the same events and can come to different conclusions. I think that's what gives history its richness and its colour. So yes, I couldn't agree more.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much, Will, for all the organisational work you've done and agreeing to do the editing. Thank you very much indeed. And yeah, goodbye.
Goodbye.